Welcome also from my side. We have 1 hour together. I hope we'll continue with the same energy that Martin gave us. And thank you also for bridging the topic with your last point on flood and the importance of co-development. We have seen it in the morning mentioning Fathom collaborating with Aeon Impact Forecasting, JBA collaborating with ARA. And mentioning this company, I actually invite already my panelists to come and sit on stage. We have today with us Jane Toothill, Managing Director of the JBA. I actually think I'm gonna sit, they told me to sit down there. Okay, so, yeah, first. Then we have Ollie Wing from Chief Research Officer from Fathom, and then Petr Puncochar, Global Head of Flood Model Development from Impact Forecasting. Still, before giving them the floor and start, I hope, an animated discussion with them, I would like to give 5 minutes to David Schenkel, so invite him on the stage, to inspire us with the work he's now doing at Reor 20. David was a colleague of us, and now head of product at Reor 20, which is a Swiss startup. If you want, the new kid on the block, or more around the block, since we are also based here in Zurich. And they're developing AI-driven flood risk models. So again, I hope we'll have just 5 minutes, but inspiring on how you develop this model and how they are used to understand the risk at the property level.
Thanks, Federica.
Thank you.
And thanks a lot for inviting me to speak here. I said only 5 minutes. I'll try to first give you a bit of an overview of what it is we're doing and why we're here, and then end on a few thoughts that hopefully serve as some interesting points for discussion for the panel afterwards. Obviously, a bit scared talking in front of such an esteemed panel because they all know it way better than I do, but I still try to hopefully bring some interesting points up. Now, what are we doing? Federica mentioned understanding flood risk at location or at property level, better to say. And if we try to do that currently with risk models that are used in the industry, we run into some issues. And we saw that as well, having worked me at Swiss Re and others of the company as well. And so maybe we can change something. Now, what are these issues? Well, if you look at flood risk modeling today, here for Toothill risk in Switzerland, actually it's a case in Switzerland, it looks something like this. And what you will very quickly notice is that the flood goes straight through the building, and that is a slight misrepresentation of what probably happens if the flood starts interacting with the building. That's a massive, massive difference in risk. Actually, in this case, we're going from about 30 centimeters of flooding to almost 2 meters. So if you really want to help this property owner as an insurer to understand his risk better and maybe even mitigate, you should probably know that and look at it like that. Second issue, flooding, of course, is a duration that also heavily impacts your property damage. It impacts your business interruption potential, also how long you have to react to flood, not explicitly modeled in the way we model flood risk nowadays as an industry. And then last but not least, we've only talked about depth, but is depth always the same risk? Well, not really, right? Germany showed that sadly quite impressively 2 years ago. In this case, these two risks have exactly the same depth for a return probability, but risk number 1 had sort of static water. They had to dry out after an event, and risk number 2 had this happen. And you see on the left our simulation, on the right the actual event. Not particularly deep, and that's not a river, by the way, that's a road usually. Huh? And here goes the wall. In the end, this was a total loss. It was a textile factory here in Switzerland. It took them 2 years to rebuild. Why is nobody modeling this at scale? Well, it's quite simply too expensive to do. So engineering companies do that on smaller scales for properties or for city centers or something like that. But if you want to do this at a country level the size of the US or Australia, it's just way too expensive. And that's where we come in. So we're a group of fluid dynamics PhDs from MIT and ETH, deep learning PhDs, and then people like me who've basically been born and raised at Swiss Re. We taught in AI the physics of flood. And with that, we managed to basically simulate what a sort of full fluid dynamics simulator would do, but hundreds of thousands of times faster and also quite a bit simpler to run. We have this as a prototype, so we know it works, but it doesn't yet work at scale. So we're still about 12 to 18 months away from actually running that on a production level, but we're already trying to hit the market and gain sort of first experience. What we're doing already is on a commercial risk level. This is very small. I'm happy to show this to you afterwards in a slightly bigger format. Working with FM Global to help them really understand the risk at a specific commercial site and also help them to model, well, what can you do to mitigate? And what's the return on investment on that mitigation? And of course, where we want to go with this is ultimately really run countrywide models and also bring that to residential insurance. We're already partnering now with an insurer in Australia, hopefully pretty soon, and also talking in the US to some, to really build risk scores that not just look at depth, but also at the force on the walls and on the duration, and also take into account, of course, property characteristics. So something like first floor elevation, what does this mean in relation to the hazard at this level of detail? This is where we're standing currently. And of course, if anyone is interested, happy to talk afterwards also during the break a bit more about this. But just for this panel, I thought about some implications that this will have and that might be interesting also to discuss. The obvious one is that we're going from point-based to property-based lookups. That's tricky. And that also means that probably in the beginning, we'll have a very sort of niche market in the US and Australia, not just go global. It also means we need an up-to-date building data set and also have this in sync with the insurers we're working with. And not to forget also the defenses, both locally and a bit more on the municipal level, because just because it's high resolution doesn't mean that it's a more accurate model. I want to make this very clear. So we're still fighting with the same challenges that anyone else does in terms of, okay, how do we define frequency and severity of events happening? And how do we make sure that this is really a good model? Also create some quite nice opportunities here. First thing about aggregation and disaggregation. So you can do that now on a property level, so based on your property data set. And we've already done this with an insurer and actually found it quite nice at just how simple it starts becoming. And actually also that it works quite well in that case, which is good for us. And I think the most interesting one here for this group also is being able to very rapidly recalculate risk if you have new data. That can be for climate change scenarios, but more so for urbanization, right? So what if there's a new area of a town built up or new defenses installed, or what we had recently, a commercial risk that installs new defenses, and then suddenly all the residential properties downstream had a much increased risk because they suddenly had to deal with a lot more water. So understanding, identifying this and being able to rerun risks, I think that's really where we see the biggest application of what we're building. I said not quite there yet, but still already very happy to talk about this after the break, and now very keen on the panel session and hearing also maybe one or two comments from them on what we're developing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. Please stick around. We are gonna take questions for you at the end of the panel. We have the last 50 minutes dedicated to Q&A. Now, before going to the discussion, I would like to take less than 10 minutes to introduce you to the topic we will discuss together and make them, I hope, more tangible for you in the sense that we are looking at the challenges when it comes to flood models. Of course, not all of them, otherwise we will stay here for more than a week for sure. We tackled just two of them that, in my opinion, haven't been discussed enough, and there's a lot of uncertainty on how to actually manage them, how to tackle them when it comes to our models. And to make them more relevant or more understood for you, I would like to bring some data analytics to make them, again, more maybe understood. Now, I start showing you a lot of text that I put together as a quick summary of what I think are some of the key challenges today, far from pretending to be comprehensive or complete, but a few topics here and there, and we will then focus on the green one and the blue one. And some of them were also touched by David as well. I will start maybe with just mentioning the first box on the right, on the left, sorry, on hydrodynamic modeling. So really the hazard. If you want, and that's what engineering company does, you can really go down with the physical laws, given that you have good input data, and simulate where water moves from precipitation down to the little channel, then in the little street, down in the sewage system, and so on. But can you do it? Is it feasible for a CAT model that has to run at the country scale? Performance computing issues. How do you balance these two parts? How do we make the country size models as precise as possible without reaching these computational boundaries. Big challenge, and I know all three companies that you are representing have been tackling them maybe in a bit different way, but I park it there from now, given that I think we have been discussing and there's a lot of material on how to tackle this one. Quite similar with climate change. Super relevant topic, everybody of course admitting that, and I think we are on a good path on understanding how to include this in our models. We have flood maps under different climate scenarios, also models. Regulators are picking up and including that in their requirements. So we also park this topic for today. Vulnerability, another big challenge, a box of, if you want, uncertainty, claims data, everybody keeps their own, they do different stuff when they have them. OASIS is a great instrument to take care of the uncertainty with the sampling. So yeah, mentioning that, but on opening for today, what I think we could discuss a lot more is the topic of urbanization and flood defenses when we look at the hazard, and exposure, data quality and transparency when we look at the exposure box. So urbanization, it's about the fact that has been in all the last decades a growing trend of sealing our surfaces, and how do we represent that in our models? And at the same time, while you do that, there is this trend, are actually the countries keeping up with flood defense infrastructures? Are they ready to protect our environment versus the hydrologies that's changing because of urbanization? And the second topic on exposure is the fact that flood is such a granular peril. It can change if in a matter of few meters if you're very exposed to flooding or not, just because of the altitude. But we don't often receive data that tell us this site is located precisely here at this address. They're aggregated, so how can we take care of this uncertainty? Now, these are the general topics. I said I would like to make them more relevant to you by bringing some numbers that you might have been, or I mean, we might have heard that's an important issue, but maybe really compare country by country and give some numbers, I think is something that we haven't seen often. Here, I know it's a lot of numbers, maybe too many, but it's a global map where we chose few countries globally and showing how much surface have been sealed, so the grown up of build up surfaces in every country in the last 20 years. So if we take, I don't know, China, for example, one of the biggest pie, they have 68% of more surface that's sealed compared to 20 years ago. And out of this surface, the dark green part of the pie is showing actually how much they have been building in areas exposed to flooding. So half of the new sealed surface are actually are exposed to flooding in China. And you see a bit of comparison among the different countries. All they have a pie, like they have increasing their built-up surfaces. It's interesting every country. And you might think, yeah, but actually the dark green part is not so large, right? So are we taking good care and thinking in urban planning not to build in flood-exposed area? Yes and no. Now, second full plot, same countries. We are seeing instead the growth of rate, so how fast are we building in areas very exposed to flooding, up to 50 years return period, the dark green bars, versus completely outside. And you see that there's actually no difference. So no really faults or taking care of the fact, let's leave those areas that are exposed to flooding, very exposed to flooding, 50 years return period, more protected. And if I take a country like Italy, I think you understood by now with my accent that I'm from Italy, and there was a very catastrophic flooding this year. You see like 20% of growth rate, both in area exposed or not exposed. And at the same time, now if we look at the growth rate of population is not really increasing. So even if there's not a real population growth, we'll just keep expanding our city malls and constructing more and more. And we are not keeping up, I think I'm allowed to say that, with Italy, and we have seen it, that was one of the causes of the flooding back in May. We are not keeping up with investment in flood defenses, in making sure that they are up to date, maintained, and efficient for today's risk. When it comes to population, again, it's a similar plot as before, and you see that, again, population is growing both in areas very exposed to flooding or outside flood risk. So with this, I made more tangible the urbanization aspect, and then I will turn to our panelists on how to tackle it in our model. The second one, the blue box, was on exposure. And here I'm sharing with you the resolution at which we receive exposure data from our clients in the treaty business, geographical resolution. So how much of the TIV we write, we actually receive in the form of lat-long or exact address versus zip level aggregation or even cresta level aggregation. And what you see here that for the very few key markets, US, Germany, Australia, the trajectory, let's say, is good, is becoming a standard to share high resolution data. We can say 80% of the data we received are at address or exact level. But as soon as you move out of these countries, and we go to, for example, China and India, also very relevant insurance markets, there the exposure we receive at high resolution is down to 20–40%. And here we're looking at key markets. If you move to other ones like Thailand, that we saw very exposed to also the urbanization and population growth, there we don't receive lat-long resolution data usually, or Indonesia, or Canada, another important market when it comes to flood. And I think other than maybe few globals and less than countable in one hand national insurance, all the others don't provide us, and as much as us, also to the other broker, through the other brokers or reinsurance company, data at high resolution. So which assumptions should we take in our models? How can we reduce the uncertainty that can be inevitable when you don't have good quality data to start with? And then when you put all of this together, I think you're kind of overwhelmed and you wonder yourself, okay, but how can we use these flood models as we try to do from understanding portfolio accumulation, study that, down to using the same exact model to compute a tariff for a single site. Can they be used equally? And this is maybe the big question that I would like to pose to our panelists towards the end. And maybe I leave it also here for our thinking. I take my seat, and I think we can kick it off with the urbanization topic, if you agree. And you tell me who wants to start with that.
I can start with that,
Please?
if it's helpful.
That's great.
And I think I can wrap climate change into the same set of comments, because from the perspective of modelling companies, particularly for flood, which can be impacted by the actions of man on the ground far more than, say, wind or earthquake, we're very much in the business of trying to identify worldwide where we most need to update models because of change. And that might be change in the climate, it might be change in weather patterns, so it might be inter-annual or interdecadal, but it also might be due to climate change. We're needing to pick up where there is significant change that impacts the rainfall. But once that rainfall has happened and we've worked out if there's change there that's significant so that we need to update what we're doing, it's a fairly similar question to come on to think about urbanisation. And as you say, there are changes everywhere in terms of increasing urbanisation and increasing proportions of sealed surfaces. There's also changes in things like agricultural practice, and that's been discussed following the Italy flood that you mentioned particularly, because things like improved drainage of land, then that can lead to faster runoff. But again, that then will have an impact on the relationship between the flow that we see in rivers and the runoff from surfaces. And that's another change that we have to be able to pick up on as modelling companies, because we're going to come along and say, okay, where are we going to be updating our maps and our models this year? And we need to pick up those changes where they are significant. And sometimes those changes might be at odds with each other. So there are parts of the world where climate change can cause a reduction in flood risk. But if at the same time there is an increase in the proportion of sealed surfaces leading to high levels of runoff, actually the impact of those two things may partly balance each other. But from our point of view as modellers, this is all about trying to detect where change is happening in rainfall records, in flow records, and eventually also in flooding, because obviously the urbanisation and the defence impact has, there's changes on the ground as to what happens in the flood itself as well. And I think it's one of the, for me, it's one of the sad things that one of the most interesting things you presented there, it's those building footprints, because that data worldwide, you made the comment yourself, it's impossible to get hold of. So we can model the impacts of urbanisation when it comes through in flow records and it's seen to be significant, but actually knowing what buildings are where on the ground, even at market level, never mind for a particular portfolio, is very, very difficult for us.
Thank you. You made me think also, and maybe one of you can follow up on this one, the need of update cycle of the models to relook and maybe change few aspects here and there, few inputs data here and there to take into account these changes. How about your strategy?
Well, I'll just throw a deliberately contrarian viewpoint out there, and that I don't think that urbanization has a particularly large or detectable impact on hazard alone. I mean, obviously the trends that we see in flood losses through history, there's more stuff available to be damaged, but is it changing the hazard to a detectable degree? Well, we can look at research that's looked into this. There's a great paper by Lucas Goodmanson, looks at 8,000 river gauges, you know, that's really all the usable data there is globally, and didn't really find much impact when you model the effect of changing land use. Are you being able to replicate the trends? The answer was that it was a negligible change. So that's kind of what we lean on here. Now, there's always going to be case studies where you can find urbanization has had a detectable impact on certain floods. I think particularly it's for pluvial floods. Maybe that's why it doesn't show up in river gauge records so much. But yeah, I mean, the starting point is you've got your list of problems that you're trying to solve in a flood model. Do we think that trends in urbanization is something that we need to sink a load of time into? My personal view is not a whole lot. I mean, when it comes to how urbanization is represented in different models, to some extent, it might already be there. You know, if the approach that we take to estimate extreme flows globally, well, the percentage of the catchment that's covered by impervious surfaces is a predictor in that model. So if we're using recent data on that, then potentially the recent changes have kept pace there. Similarly, when it comes to, you know, just rain on grid models, you're using land use data to determine the infiltration rates of that rainfall. Well, if you're going to use recent data, it should reflect that. So it's a relatively, easy is the wrong word, but the data that is in models, if they've been built relatively recently, should control for a lot of this issue. The building data is an interesting one. You know, a nice presentation there from David on how that can augment local flood hazard. But the difficulty is, you know, this question here is talking about flood models as this homogeneous blob, like they're all the same thing and all performant in all circumstances. But there's, you know, quite a lot of difference between our global flood hazard maps and what, the Environment Agency in the UK can do at a local level. So they're not really the same thing. So maybe even discussing them all in the same format, because they're built at such different scales, is maybe not particularly useful. But at the large scale, you're trying to get buildings out of the elevation data. They cause problems if you're trying to model floods that have buildings in them. If you think at the global scale, the best data that we have for understanding what the Earth's terrain is radar being fired at the Earth from space. And if you don't try and get buildings out of those returns, all of your cities just appear as big hills. Big hills tend not to flood. You get a very optimistic flood model if you build a flood model with elevation data that don't remove buildings out of them. But you're actually trying to get a bare Earth representation of the terrain, because model fidelity is not in a place at scale yet to stitch buildings into the data. The elevation data aren't good enough to do that. And the resolution required to represent that is really high. You have a whole new set of modeling problems. So we're still at the stage of how can we get buildings out of the model before putting them in. So yeah, big challenge.
Thank you. I love contradiction. Please.
Yeah, well, you asked about model update frequency, and I think the important thing is to see where there is significant change. Yeah. And often a model update will be driven by new terrain data that does a better job or is higher resolution. And that is more common for us at the moment, say, than updating a model because of changes in flow regime that might be caused by urbanisation, changes to climate change. I mean, one example, we find that there's a discernible signal in about a quarter of the gauge stations in the UK due to climate change from on the river flood side. But the important thing is to have an update cycle that's very frequent and goes out and assesses those things and update where you need to, because there is change.
Yeah.
One more thing, sorry. I'm sorry. Just while we're on that topic, the other interesting thing about trend analysis, particularly when you're using river gauges, is how many extremes have we even observed to understand trends? Well, very few of them, right? So a lot of these analyses that might think, yes, you can see a detectable change in flood regime because of urbanization or indeed anything else. You're looking at maybe the average annual flow at a given station across 30 years or however long the gauge is. So you're really limited in the time series that you have available to do this analysis. And because you haven't really even observed that many extremes, you have to look at the trends in very frequent floods, in some cases largely irrelevant floods. We keep the average annual flood within the river channel. It doesn't cause any damage. So why do we care about the trend in it? Maybe we don't. But I guess that's the important thing when it comes to these changes, particularly like urbanization and land use change. We generally do see, and this is what the models say rather than observations, because it's difficult to do on an observational basis, is that they have most impact at the very high frequency end of the spectrum. And actually, once you get to very extreme flood events, land use becomes, basically irrelevance in the face of that sheer mass of water. Please speak.
Thank you. Yeah, I should have taken a piece of paper because we've already touched quite a few topics. But coming back to the basic, I think in the ideal world, the concept of urbanization would be more left to model users and not to model builders or model developers as such, because we should see the urbanization in the exposure data. But what I very much like was the slide which Federica showed, which was just before this one, saying the quality of the data. So clearly, if we work with let's say in the Western world, where I think the amount of latitude longitude data which I had in hands was even actually higher than the ratio. And working in, let's say, countries in Asia or elsewhere, I would say the quality of latitude longitude data was just zero in many of the countries. So that's actually a serious problems which can handle that. Very good point is the update of the flood hazard data or of the actual model itself, because it comes as a package. Basically, in impact forecasting, I would say we update flood models, or at least those which are like widely used, in average, I would say in 5 to 7 years. But to be honest, we never did it because of the urbanization or before one population. This mainly is because of simply that better data. We can provide a better service. We have more up-to-date flood protection levels and so on. What is also worth saying that those, let's say, insurers who are using our data mainly for the tarification, so for the primary underwriting, they actually hate these changes. Because imagine you build your entire basically strategy of primary underwriting, then you change the data, and then this entire change, and you may have 20%, if the change is substantially, you have 20% of your risk falling to the different categories and you need to reprice it. And now how do you do it? These are not popular changes. So we are also trying to be very, mitigating what is it, and we need to be very open and very, very clear in communicating why we build the change and basically present it, that it's a step forward for the market and so on, despite we know that it may cause a lot of harm on that. I think I forgot quite a few topics, but I've been talking enough, so.
Thank you. I would like to add maybe a last piece on the urbanization topic. I mean, I could agree on both of you, right? Important to look at the changes relative between the different drivers. Urbanization, actually, if I have good input data, is already there, the land ceiling and so on. I think it's missing, and for me, it's the counterpart, or let's say that the brother with urbanization is flood defenses. Are they taking up the same rate? And how to include them in our models, given that maybe in UK we have good data, but in other countries not. We don't know the return period, we don't know where they are, we don't know if countries are investing in it. So there is uncertainty. We now have on Oasis the ability to put uncertainty also on the hazard side. Is it that maybe something to consider to take better care of this uncertainty, or taking into account possibility of this flood defenses to break, to be over top? Maybe just a small comment on this, or it's actually not a real topic and doesn't really influence the expected loss at the end of the day.
It's a very good topic, I think. It's because, I mean, flood defenses in principle are very often the weakest part of the model. Depends highly on the quality of the data. That's one of the reasons why in impact forecasting we go through slightly different way, building individual detailed model for the smaller countries, while Fathom, for instance, built, and I think GBA partially as well, built the countrywide, the continental scale models. In our models, we have a few things or a few methods, a few ways how to implement the flood predictions data in the models, depending on the type and other things. However, what we don't have, so we can work with standard of protection of the particular measure, and we can work with the overtopping. But so far, on besides two cases, which is Dutch flood and flood model for Netherlands, so obviously both very flat countries, we don't have any sort of probabilistic flood defense failure, which is actually a very tricky concept if you think, because you will have probabilistic flood defense failure in a probabilistic model. So the amount of combination starts to boost, and it's not a simple task how we do it. We work on a few concepts where we think that could work, but I think this is a very interesting topic which brings high uncertainty. But on the other hand, if you don't have a good flood protection or flood defense information, then no statistical sampling or anything can actually help to get a credible flood losses. That's the idea.
It's certainly one of the weaker data components that we have to work with. But to put a slightly more hopeful spin on it, then particularly where we can get hold of high resolution 5-meter or better terrain data, and it's not all the world, but it's a lot of North America, it's a lot of continental Europe, then increasingly AI is enabling us to determine where defences are and pull those out automatically. So you're quite right that some countries have much better data available than others. But actually, if we can get good quality terrain data, then increasingly we can use AI to get defence information. Just things will get better, right?
Well, I'll drag Jane's optimism back down again. I mean, there's lots of places where you can be innovative in defence detection. I think we've both tried approaches like that and published them. But yeah, you can only do it where you've got good data. Seems to be the just repeated call about everything. But if you're talking about large scale models, I mean, even in the UK, we think, well, we've got great defense data there, while still a lot of that's missing or not up to date. The US, much the same. There's even fewer defense structures in the available databases there. And so you're left in this world where you've got to make assumptions about things that are highly sensitive when it comes to losses. And that's just really tricky. And I guess the first point is to kind of be transparent about it is one of the best things you can be. You know, if we're talking about wide domain flood catastrophe models, the idea that flood protections are represented well in frankly any of them should not be really anything anybody should or would claim, I would think. And so then it becomes this major uncertainty in how do you deal with it. And I guess the easy get out of jail card is you offer users flexibility in how they model their portfolios. Can you tweak the defense assumptions in the model? Can you specify a height or a standard of protection at a given location in your model and look at how sensitive it is. But yeah, it's a huge data scarcity problem, and there's great innovation when it comes to AI processing of remote sensing data that might solve it, but there's actually the really dull answer is just to get teams of graduates to trawl through data to try and identify these things, which is just a horrible job to ask anybody to do, but could have quite a lot of impact on model fidelity. The only note of optimism, since we'll try and be optimistic, is that the NASA surface water and ocean topography mission launched last year. That's been like 20 years in gestation, $1 billion, and it's the first NASA satellite dedicated to hydrology. It's the most exciting advance in the field in its entire history. And once we start getting data from that, we've got Fathom through the University of Bristol and through many universities globally are starting to work out how we can integrate data coming from that satellite into flood models. What's unique about it is just how many observations it's going to make of relatively large rivers. So large rivers will now have an accurate altimetry reading, so the water levels within rivers 35 times per year, which is amazing because most of these rivers don't have gauges on them. So we can now detect it with some regularity from space. And a big unknown in our models and probably everybody else's models is how big you assume river channels to be. You might link that to your flood frequency analysis and say, I think the channels can hold the 2-year flood, the 5-year flood, whatever. But it's still an assumption, even if you can base it in some empirical evidence. But what we'll now understand from SWAT, this satellite, is be able to understand how often these rivers are flowing out of bank. And we'll see that the 2-year assumption makes no sense in the wetlands of the River Niger, and it doesn't make much sense on the River Thames in London either. And we'll actually now have data to start understanding the outer bank flows, and so by proxy have a better understanding of defenses when we start to see actually these big rivers flowing through megacities aren't flowing out of bank with natural frequency, and you can plug that information into the model. So yeah, there is hope.
I think there's a note of caution on the defences as well, though, and that says even if you can get very, very good information about where it is and how high it is, information about how well it is maintained is very much more difficult to get hold of and can change on a daily basis if damage occurs to a defence. Now, that might have a lesser impact in terms of the overtopping scenario, but if we pick up on the breach concept, our ability to say, is a particular defence going to breach or not, we might put a nominal probability on it. We just don't know. And the maintenance standard can have a big impact on that. So I think we're all going to concur that defence information and the uncertainty that comes off the back of that is a very big component.
Yeah. We've been seeing also some crazy stories from the US on them being overtopped because of lack of maintenance. So, yeah. Thank you. Let's look at the second topic before wrapping it up to hopefully a positive outcome on the exposure. Petr, you already mentioned a bit your view.
You mean on exposure or the?
No, on the exposure, on the accuracy we receive the data, and should we think, well, if I receive data at the aggregate CRESTA level, there's no point to use such a sophisticated model,
Yeah.
or there's still a benefit in it? What are the assumptions you're taking into account?
Let's focus on the, let's say, poor exposure data quality, which is a massive problem in lots of parts of the countries, and a huge sum insured are actually coming or are located in or are covered basically by those data. I think it's useful because what other chance you have than using any sort of CAT model? The question is how you do it and so on. In the workflow, which I would actually recommend in the use of our models, or pretty much all the CAT models, will be to perform like a decent, let's say, disaggregation method. We have some inside elements where we can put some disaggregation patterns or a table that can actually get you from, let's say, cresta level down to postal code level. And then we have additional level, which is embedded in the model. So not in the platform, but in the way how, the hazard is distributed within, let's say, postal code units and so on. So we have some things how we can tackle that. On the other hand, these problems require a very high cooperation with the model user. So people from the CAT management, and they're often, difficult in terms of data preparation and things as such. Maybe also would like to add one more point you had very nice figures from Thailand where the built-up areas grows, and I think big chunk of them is because of the growth of industrial estates, as Japan is using Thailand as a backyard basically for their manufacture production. If you have latitude, longitude, it also it doesn't save you much, especially if you have massive industrial estate and you have one location and you don't know whether it's a gate, whether it's a center, what it actually represents. So for that, we built like industrial estate database, and we can, through similar patterns as are the postal code level, hazard sampling, we can apply on that, which is the case, but again comes with some other problems. And if we go too much in details, we will actually reach the same problem which David had here on actually having a building there or not. My very last thing I would say, if I fall off in the coma today and I'll woke up in some 30 years time, what I would like to have is not to have latitude, longitude, but to have some pre-agreed unit, which will have some, physical parameters of the risk, but it will have also some geometry object. And that's what will be used in CAT modeling. And we will be having some estimates. Deltares already has some studies, basically how to calculate the hazard surrounding one particular cell. But nowadays, I think the CAT models aren't so much on there. And honestly, I think the CAT models or flood models are one step ahead of the exposure handling. So we have technologies that will handle that, but we can't really use it because the exposure is not there. So sorry, Federica, I little escaped from the topic, but
very good point. Would you like to add a different perspective or?
Sure. Yeah. Well, positive. Oasis. We now have stochastic disaggregation in Oasis, which is amazing. So it means that when we have exposure data, some insured is aggregated to some absurd unit, you can actually do something with that. I know that seems ridiculous, but so long as you're doing something sensible with that, i.e. across that polygon unit, you're sampling flood depths at exposed locations and creating, probabilistic hazard distribution. So, not just taking the midpoint of a polygon and treating it as a lat long, nothing like that. That's the first step. So just actually sampling all the possible hazard intensities. And then the next step is sampling from that in an appropriate way. There's lots of really interesting discussions about how you should be sampling, between locations during an event. What's the correlation structure that the sample should have? Because in some cases the residuals should be correlated, in some cases they shouldn't be. So there's now the flexibility within Oasis to sample, with independent random numbers and correlated random numbers. We can get really in the weeds with that, but that's super important. I mean, the great Dag Lohman's been banging on about this for years, and he's right. This correlation in secondary uncertainty and how you sample it basically defines what's going on in the tail. And so we need to be able to understand it. So the good thing is with aggregate exposures, we can produce an answer, and the samples can be held all the way through into the financial model, and the tail will be reflective of those uncertainties. And you'll just get really big error bars if they're really big polygons that are aggregated to. But that's the best that can be done. But I guess the negative note is it's just a sticking plaster for poor data, and you're not going to be able to understand flood risk about something where you don't know where it is. That should just be fairly obvious, I think. And as Petr said, and I know that Jane's team work on this as well, being able to stitch building footprints into CAT models and no longer treat things as points. I mean, we've got latitude, longitude points as the gold standard benchmark here, when, you know, in an ideal world, we'd be aspiring to do even better than that, and taking that same approach for disaggregation where you're sampling flood depths within a polygon. Well, do that for large sites, do that even for small sites. You know, that's the ultimate goal here. Yeah, I don't know how to wrap that up.
Thank you. Yeah.
Some positives, some negatives.
Also, I mean, that long point, sometimes, you know, it's at the...
It's nowhere near the building anyway.
Exactly. It's at the mailbox,
Yeah,
not actually at the buildings. So, yeah, thank you. Any last word from you? I will take the wrapping up. Jane, you want to add anything also on the...
No, that's fine.
Yeah, and maybe my wrapping up, and you made me think about that when you mentioned climate change at the beginning, is that at the quite beginning of the discussion of climate change and so on, we were, the public, if you want, was in the be afraid of this uncertainty and say, can we really understand that? Does it make sense to model it if there is so much uncertainty, right? And now we know that modeling is better than nothing, right? We need to take into consideration these aspects. And having a model with transparent assumption, as you said, Ollie, I still believe give us a better instrument than nothing, than just doing, you know, a Pareto curve, even if there are all these challenges, and hopefully also growing R&D team because to take all of them into consideration. Is it a good wrap up?
Yeah.
You have something to add, please?
One more thing is, flood models in principle are very uncertain tools, which has very high, you know, level of uncertainty. And if you add a climate change, then the uncertainty grows so much. Indeed, what I think from all model developers, including I, but we try to do our best, is to be absolutely open. What are the underlying assumptions, including some of the limitations which are embedded in the CAT model, so the model can be useful? Because technically, I can imagine, or I've seen some application of the CAT models where I would say that taking some sort of Pareto curve, which you mentioned, would actually do a better job. But there are things that can be do around, but it just depends how we all cooperate on the use of the model and how all the assumptions are known to anyone who is using the model. Because there's quite a lot of installation. If we don't do it, we are cutting the branch we are sitting on for pretty much all the industry.